The Healer and the Shadow Curse. Elias wasn't much for towns. He found people clustered together often brought out the worst in each other. Petty grievances, jealousy, masking desperation. Towns stank of it all. So his visit to Willow Creek was one of necessity solely. Resupplying tonics, trading for ingredients not found deep in his own woodland. It was business in, business out. Yet even in a simple barter town like this, there was an undercurrent of fear. Eyes cast too low, whispered conversations that silenced when he got close. Strange for a healer and no stranger to misfortune. Willow Creek was no different outwardly, a market, an inn, a handful of shops, until one visited the cemetery. Its scale seemed wrong, as if made for a town 4 times the size. Some graves were fresh, others were broken, names blurred by rain and overgrowth. There were more headstones than houses, it seemed. Strange times? Old Tom the Miller remarked when Elias voiced this observation. They'd struck up a tentative conversation while sharing an evening broth at the inn. Used to be a quiet place. Accidents happen, sure, but last 2 years, folk go missing. Some bodies turn up at forest's edge, torn like by beasts. Then there's those as just vanish. He wouldn't meet Elias's gaze, and a chill swept in on the hearth fire's warmth. That night, as if summoned by old Tom's tales, Elias was awoken by a rough knocking. A gruff councilman was on the doorstep, several shadowed figures in tow. Whispers of, "In Shadow Forest, gold if..." By dawn, he was following the group towards the forest's edge, thick mist hugging the ground. Willow Creek always sat just beside the Shadow Forest, but the trees held themselves back, a border no sane villager willingly crossed. Superstition, perhaps, but there was a weight to the woodland's silence, even from a distance. The bodies had been laid out in a small clearing, a twisted cruelty playing out. 2 men, bound around the torso, suspended from a thick, gnarled branch. They couldn't have been hanged long. There was no bloat, no flies, yet their mouths gaped in frozen screams. Beside them lay the corpse of a shepherd dog, skull sunken as if from a crushing blow. "We think some foul creature got him," one villager muttered, clutching at a hunting knife like a child clings to a blanket. Gold was promised if Elias transported the remains back to Willow Creek for consecrated burial, and his potions kit was strapped to the back of his old mare. Strange, though, that such a request would be directed at an outsider. Were they so afraid to even handle their own dead? The mare whickered nervously, but greed outweighed a flicker of his better instincts. The sooner these corpses were off his hands, the quicker he'd be out of this oppressive place. Lifting the men proved surprisingly easy. There was a hollowness to them, flesh less resistant. It wasn't decay, but an eerie lack of vitality. The return journey was uneventful enough until a deep rut sent a sickening jolt through the cart. In that instant, an assortment of glass bottles Elias kept by his feet tumbled, some smashing open on the cart's bed. An infusion of nightshade for fevers mingled with lavender balm he used for burns and stings. Then came the worst, a flask of distilled foxglove and wolfsbane intended only for the direst of poisonings. The liquid hissed against bare flesh, staining it an otherworldly blue. "Whoa, whoa, girl," he tried to calm the suddenly terrified mare, the cart lurching as she fought her reins. A scream froze on his tongue. It wasn't the horse. First, one body jolted straight with an echoing crack, eyes snapping open and filled with a milky nothingness. Next, the dog, its form jerking back to a mockery of life. Then the other man, his body convulsing as it somehow tore free of its bonds. For a horrifying moment, he swung limply through the air, broken neck lolling horribly, before he crashed to the forest floor. They did not rise gracefully. Instead, with grotesque snaps and pops, the limbs jerked to unnatural angles, movements ragged and uncoordinated. Elias had seen death in all its ugliness. But this this was a perversion. The men seemed to stare right through him, milky orbs alight with something primal, insatiable. That same hunger twisted the dog's features, broken skull knitted and dripping as it rose back onto its paws. Elias did not hesitate this time. Whipping the mare, the cart swerved down the narrow forest path, but they were gaining. Impossible speed propelled their corrupted forms along, ragged moans drifting as they clawed over roots and fallen branches. He caught glimpses over his shoulder of snapping jaw lines, flesh hanging loose, stained by his spilled potions. This was far more than mere reanimation. Ahead, blessedly, Willow Creek was coming into sight, yet as he entered the clearing by the cemetery, an even worse discovery struck him. It was empty. Not a soul dared the streets. Even the cattle-penned backyards of houses were eerily silent. He couldn't risk returning to town, that much was clear. He lashed the mare with more force than he ever desired, and the terrified animal surged onto the main road out of Willow Creek. He did not look back, even as those moans faded into the thickening forest silence. Elias never learned what fate met those left behind. Whether the creatures spawned within the shadow forest remained captive to its bounds, or if they would carry their curse outward onto other unwitting victims. There was a sickening suspicion rising in his gut as he fled for his own solitary life. Whatever potion had given those things unnatural life, they weren't going to simply stay dead a second time. Willow Creek would remain a silent tomb on his maps from that day forth. Though whispers did reach him on the wind, carried by traders he rarely ventured close to. Whispers of livestock mutilated, empty farmhouses, and an ever-growing expanse of tombstones within a place that dared not bury its own. Some stories even swore on moonless nights that you could hear the moans of shambling figures and a hollow bark of a monstrous hound still hunting through the mists of the shadow forest. But none would blame Elias for never daring to seek the truth. Some curses just aren't worth breaking. The shadow falls. It began with silence. Not the tense hush of fear, but an absence of familiar sounds. Birdsong ceased. Crickets quieted. Then, a ripple. One dog barking in alarm, answered by another in the distance until the chorus formed a chilling wave through the town. Every beast in Willow Creek, once mundane, now sensed the taint clinging to the rising dawn. Within homes, sleepers jerked awake. An echo of dread that had haunted their nights for months was now an iron weight pinning them to their beds. They knew this wasn't merely nightmare spilling into waking hours. No single horror could command such stillness, followed by this instinctive animal revulsion. Sarah was a widow, her husband lost to a fever some winters back. He was buried out there, beyond those looming walls. A tremble she couldn't control racked her form. Rising, she peered through a narrow window toward the cemetery, and a sob choked in her throat. There were figures amongst the graves, moving with wrongness even from this distance. Too slow at first, their heads twitching like broken puppets. Yet, there were glimmers of the purposeful woven into the ungainliness, as if old habits refused to fully wither. Old Tom. Sarah choked again. The miller lived closest to the graveyard, just out of view behind the general store. She had promised, whispered by candlelight to another fearful neighbor, that she'd watch tonight. Had he made it to his door in time? Had the dead... "Mama!" Her son, no more than 8 years old, stood in the doorway. Eyes so wide and dark they devoured his face. She swept him up, smothering his whimper against her. There was no solace to be offered, no lie that could sound even remotely true. Just a whispered plea to whatever gods might yet listen. "Thomas, stay quiet. Very quiet." From somewhere off in the distance, a scream rang out. Human, shrill, then cut agonizingly short. They came on in 3s and 4s, not a surging horde, but trickling from every shadowed corner of the cemetery. Sarah could make out the gravedigger, and even Mrs. Ellis, eyes glazed, skin grayed, as if pulled up from the very earth in which she'd rested. One had a length of rope trailing from its mangled neck, just like those the healer would have seen. There was no blood, no fresh gore, but gaping rents in clothing, as if they'd clawed their way free. Were they driven by memory? Ritual? Could the soul be trapped within such abominations? Sarah didn't dare wait to find out. The dead moved towards the center of town, gathering near the abandoned market stalls. Then the dog, its broken-in skull healed into monstrous asymmetry, started to dig, frantically, relentlessly, as the rest looked on. When it began to whine, they joined in, clawing at the hardened dirt. From that unearthed grave, there rose not a man, but a writhing darkness. Shadows swirled upwards, taking a semblance of shape, not human, but of monstrous proportion, the outlines shifting as if hungry for flesh and bone to make itself whole. It had no true eyes, but Sarah knew it, saw the townsfolk shrinking back. No screams came now, only whimpers. Then, one voice broke through, defiant. "Burn it! Fire! Cleanse it!" There were flinches, even from the risen things. Fire was in their bones, somewhere deep. That first brave soul was old Tom. No fear of the grave held him back. He'd faced demons of a different kind, and survived. A burning scrap of fabric flung from an upper window found its mark on the creature of swirling shadows. There was no wail, no physical pain, but it reared back, the darkness writhing as it consumed the flames. Emboldened, others followed suit. They had always been a simple folk, relying on wood fires and candles. Every home had tinder and flint close at hand. Then, something unexpected. As more bits of flaming refuse met the shadow creature, it seemed to lessen, to recoil. This was no demon or forest god. It was born of that terrible mixture on those corpses. The dead did not command this thing. They were somehow tied to it, perhaps fed by it. As sparks fell upon them, too, some stumbled and collapsed, truly still this time. Willow Creek burned that night. It wasn't strategic, but born of utter desperation. They knew it would take their homes, perhaps their lives, but the fires also purged. By sunrise, the monstrous shadow thing was a wisp on the wind, extinguished along with half the town reduced to ember and ash. The dead. Most had fallen too, some in the final throes of that strange animation, others already crumbling to an accelerated decay. A handful, however, still lurked. Not mindless now, but filled with a cold rage reflected in their milky gaze. These weren't their neighbors reborn, but twisted husks fueled by the last vestiges of the curse and a desire Sarah could almost make tangible. Revenge. The potion had sparked their return, but fire had stolen its source. The healer hadn't just resurrected them, his concoction had twisted them toward its maker. Sarah watched one shambling monstrosity claw a scrap of fabric from the ashes, fabric stained a peculiar blue, and she knew their path led far beyond the smoldering ruins of Willow Creek. It would be those survivors, huddled together in the chill morning air, who would share the tale. They were changed, forever scarred by the impossible made real. But in that sharing, a warning formed. Never tamper with the dead, and pray if some fool does, that they leave no potion spills behind.